The natural history of Little River Wetlands Project, going into some of those old reports when, you know, the first surveyors were coming through this area and what were they documenting those plant communities to be. George Washington, before he was president, put his finger on this area and said, we need to protect this area because, you know, you got the movement from all the way over to New York and through the Great Lakes, all the way to the Wabash. So this was historically an important strategic area. That's why they set up the fort here.
I had long noticed this potential wetland here. It's one of the most striking geologic features in the region, called the Wabash Erie Channel. It's the outlet of Glacial Lake Maumee. The most striking thing is if you look at a regional air photo and you look at northeast Indiana, this is the single largest physical feature visible on that kind of image. It's almost like a scar, as much as 2 or 3 mile wide gash in the landscape. And if you've ever flown into Fort Wayne and you, on a clear day, and you look down, you can't miss it. It's, even if you know nothing about geology or the history here, you'll see this big, deep valley that just cuts through everything. There's no question that early humans came into this area on the heels of the glaciers. Artifacts have been found that date from at least the woodland period. So we're looking back thousands of years. Typically they were hunting what biologists like to call megafauna. Mastodons, saber-toothed cats, large wolves, a bunch of other now extinct megafauna from the Pleistocene. And you have to go back and look at the landscape as it was before European settlement, before all of the drainage alterations that have occurred since then. The Native Americans were extremely active in the Little River Valley. Native Americans were here for hundreds, if not thousands of years before European settlement, and they had names for all of these places, and the Native American names that you find around Fort Wayne are pretty numerous.
What's unique about from the Allen County, Huntington County line up to basically Sweeney Park, this area, it kind of has 2 little lobes that stretch into Fort Wayne, one through the community of Waynedale and one through along West Jefferson. This area in the 1876 plat maps was described as the marshy prairie. So this was open marshy habitat. So this was not bottomland forest. And then kind of when you about cross that county line, that's when the habitat changed, the soil types changed, and it started going into more bottomland forests. So I think most of our restorations down that way will probably be more focused in that way. And up here, we're really going to try to keep open habitats as much as possible.
Marshy prairie is an adaptation of a Native American term because it really was a prairie. A prairie is a natural community dominated by non-woody plants, essentially, maybe a few shrubs and trees, but mostly grasses, sedges, and flowering plants. But it was wet, and you can have prairies across the moisture spectrum from wet to dry. So prairie is just kind of a generic term for that kind of vegetation. Up where I live in Noble County, there are a lot of areas that I think we would call an oak woodland. They're open forests with a prairie-like understory. That's the habitat of the now extinct in Indiana woodland bison. Smaller stature than the prairie buffalo, but they grazed in these oak woodlands. In my mind, as a hydrogeologist, a marsh is an area that has standing water, shallow standing water on it most of the year. And so that tends to exclude some of the plants that you'd find in a prairie and favors dominance by certain sedges, bulrushes, things like that that tolerate sitting around in inundated environment. And of course a marsh supports a completely different suite of birds and animals than, for example, mussels. Mussels live in marshes. All sorts of fish live in marshes that aren't on a wet prairie, because wet prairie by definition doesn't have water standing around on it all the time, just maybe seasonally. This big channel that the Little River occupies, it splits into a north channel that goes to downtown Fort Wayne, and a much smaller south channel goes right over to Bluffton Road. Chief Richardville wanted his home in the Treaty of 1826 to be located where it is today, what we call the Richardville House on Bluffton Road. And as it turns out, there was a nearly continuous water connection from the Richardville House and the St. Mary's River over here to the Little River. When you look at the old aerial photos, you can see the dark tones of a channel coming through that south channel, meeting up with the Little River where it enters the valley coming down from Ossian. He could canoe from his house over to the Little River and on downstream to the Wabash River. It's interesting, the only sand dunes in the upper Wabash Valley are here in the Little River Valley in Allen County. No other place. And they start close to the Huntington County line, and there's a little dune here, a little dune there, and then larger dune fields like Fox Island. Eagle Marsh Woods is on a feature called Midway Island, and then another couple of big fields up at Sand Point. My best guess is that the sand dunes here formed about 12,000 years ago during a cold, dry period. It is also interesting that the name island, I've said that a couple times now. We have Fox Island, Midway Island, and then the Sand Point. Those are all early European settler names for what were the only dry places in the marshy prairie, in this big wet valley. And so when people would canoe up the Little River Valley, they knew from previous visitors and from Native American reports that these are the only dry places. If you need to put out, these islands are it. And so they were the first places to be settled, and really the only places to be settled in the 1800s down here, actually in the bottom of the valley, because they were dry enough. Now they're composed of sand, not a great medium for, say, growing your own food. It's just sand. But nevertheless, that's why they're called islands, because they stick up above the general wet floor of the valley.
Basically the Great Lakes, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, this 6 mile or so portage is the only piece of land where you can't go by water, or at least at that time you couldn't go by water.
The portage, of course, originally was used by the native folks that were living here, because they're the ones that showed the way, the track through the marsh to the early French fur traders and explorers through the portage that the French had named portage, that land barrier, the carrying place.
So Tecumseh owned the portage. It had been in her family lineage for generations, so we don't know exactly how that happened, but she owned and managed the portage. Now, when people would arrive at the St. Mary's River, then she would transport their boats and the items that they had in their boats across the portage to the Little River. And of course, they had to pay for that. And so it was very profitable for her and for their village.
Later on, they would make that available as a business, really, for settlers who came through, if they wanted guided through. Tecumseh, the sister of Little Turtle, would actually provide carts and animals to rent and pass people and cargo across the portage, and became the richest of the Native Americans in the country, some people say.
All our villages, or almost all our villages, were on rivers, and most of them at confluences. So we have a confluence here of 3 rivers, and so I'm sure that was very, very attractive to them to be on the water. We grew our cornfields on the riverbanks. We liked the floods because the floods would bring really rich soil, and that's where we grew our corn. Didn't have runoff from chemicals that we have today, and so it was really good land.
When we look at a site like Eagle Marsh, we go and we dig through what the government land office surveyors see in the 1850s. Just sometimes their notes about what vegetation they pass through gives us an idea to start from. And then there's fantastic references that you can go back and start to piece together from the soils, right? What type of vegetation originally developed on Powamo soils or Houghton muck or whatever else. And then we can put together a species assemblage that matches what we think probably would have been there pre-development.
We want the land to also to provide food because we ate naturally growing plants as well as those that we cultivated. Would have controlled burns of the forest so that it would support us as well. And we understood that the forest, the trees and the plants in the forest would grow better if they were regularly burned. So we understood those things, and we did what we needed to do so that the environment would support what we needed and support our lives.
In the time leading up to European settlement, I think it's safe to say the biggest way Native Americans manipulated the landscape was fire. Marshes and wet prairies do burn. During a dry year, you get a lightning strike, or maybe Native Americans ignited a fire. That was done for a number of reasons, one of which would have been to create spaces where they could grow small plots of food. It might have been to create certain habitats that favored game.
Back in when the Miami Indians were down through here, this lowland was considered the Black Swamp.
Fox Island Swamp.
It was called the Black Swamp, and this was basically before the canal come in, was all underwater. And then when the canal come in, and then more people started farming, then this area soon started draining it. And from here, from Fort Wayne all the way to Huntington, that to the left of 24 was used to be all swamp and underwater. And when you grow up as a farm kid, you're always in the fields, and then you stumble across an artifact, and then once you find your first one, and then that triggers everything after that. So
wetlands, swamps, bogs, all had food. So they were food sources. Also, for example, cattails were used in a variety of ways. Those wikiami, I should say wikiyama, the plural is wikiyama. The walls were made of cattail mats. So we would gather the cattail reeds and sew them together into mats. And they would be put around a frame of saplings that had been bent into a dome shape. And so we used those cattail reeds to make our homes. And they were made in such a way that when we'd go on those hunting trips or when we'd go to maple sugaring, all you had to do is have a frame somewhere, and you could fold up those mats and take them with you. So our villages were here and in other places. But in the winter, families and groups would leave the village to go on hunting parties. And so they would go into places where buffalo were, or other elk or other large game might be found.
We've reintroduced some native Indiana wildlife here. We've raised bison and elk here. When you get to know what they can do and the power and awareness that they absolutely have, we admired them. And there's so much fun to see bison on a frosty morning, the icy breath come out and the snow on its back. It's just beautiful to see that. And so we have done that, and these large animals are now going to be part of Elsie Nature Park.
The Europeans who were coming along, the Euro-Americans we call them, were making that track across there to continue their fur trade and the military. George Washington, for example, was looking at Thomas Hutchins' maps of this area, and he was asking Congress, he says, how could we communicate the waters of the St. Joseph with the Wabash? After Wayne's activities here, there was no military road for the delivery of materiel, and people in the east were starting to move to the west, and there was just no easy way to do it. So all these things blend in together to create this pattern of once that was set and the portage showed the way, the canal followed that, the railroads followed that, easy roads followed that. There was a big drainage project back in the day, and had they not drained it, we probably wouldn't be sitting here, I suppose, today. The idea, of course, was if you were able to drain the water, get the Little River drainage channel put through and move the water in a more controlled way, you then could improve the trails which became roads and highways, and as well as the railroad that come through the Wabash Railroad line. Probably it was in the late 1800s, I think, and it was a success.
People were still of the mentality that wetlands were to be filled in. We have the engineering know-how to fill them in so that we could make this land usable. My maiden name is Deerheimer. I used to be teased about this, but Deerheimer Bolt's contractors actually drained the swamp back in 1886. They were contractors. There was a horrible malaria outbreak at the time, so they had dredging machines that they dredged the swamp and drained it at the time.
This land was converted to farmland in about the 38. It was starting to be farmed, but certain areas like the back area by Fox Island, that wasn't turned into farm ground until the 1970s because our technologies on how to get water off properties was improving, and so they were able to drain that area for farm ground as well.
My dad bought the land out here in the 50s, 55, and we raised chickens and geese and cattle, goats, and we really enjoyed living out here because there was no traffic. We were here by ourselves, and Delancey's up the road and Miller's down the street. It was quiet, no city traffic, no lights and no sirens. It was a good growing up.
In 2005, under the direction of Paul McAfee as the executive director, we were able to put the resources together from multiple partners to go ahead and purchase Eagle Marsh.
It was a farm field. If you look that way, you'd see corn, soybeans. You would be able to see the berm of the ditch that they pumped into to drain this. This pond was here, and it's an irrigation pond. Seems kind of odd that they have to irrigate a wetland, but once you drain a wetland, you got pretty good drainage out there. So when it gets dry out, it gets pretty dry, and so then you got to irrigate it. To drain this, you got to remember this is pretty low, and we've got all kinds of pictures of it flooded. The ditch had berms, 10-foot high berms on each side, and they literally had to pump the water from ditches going into the farm fields where the tiles fed into, and they pumped it up into this ditch. There were 9 different pumps around here. Wetlands that have, peat growing, that's where they grow celery, mint. I heard mint was grown, onions probably. They used to grow that until it wore the soil down. Then you go probably into soybean and corns would be my guess.
Yeah, celery, beets, radishes, cucumbers, some corn, not too much because it was too delicate. Corn was too delicate.
They wouldn't have sold it off if it were easy farming, but in good years it was great. When it was a bad year, you know, you didn't get anything. And it kind of got worse every year too, because all the building along the sides, you know, the water flows downhill, as Sam says, and it would end up here, and you know, every year it'd be a little bit worse, you know, maybe just a little bit, but it all adds up, and it just got harder and harder to the point where they just sort of gave up and offered to sell it. We approached the landowner long before we bought it, and they wanted an ungodly amount of money for it because, you know, it was in a Boyd Township, high-priced land. Then after 2 or 3 or 4 years, they approached us and said, you know, we're ready to sell it. And it was much more reasonable, and then that's when we started working on that. And I'm talking about Eagle Marsh there, not, you know, our whole project area, we decided was about 20,000 acres in this valley. So it's just one small part of what we're really trying to accomplish in the long run.
I think it's wonderful that just as we are revitalizing ourselves and our people and our culture, we call it Emamwechike. It's the educational awakening so that we're learning more about who we are as Miami people. We're learning our language, we're learning about our culture. This part of that land is being restored to hopefully something like what our ancestors might have seen and experienced. That's wonderful connection there.